السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الحمد لله ناصر المستضعفين، والصلاة والسلام على سيد الأنبياء والمرسلين محمد وآله وصحبه أجمعين ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. أما بعد، اللهم انفعنا بما علمتنا وعلمنا ما ينفعنا وزدنا علما وفقها في الدين يا رب العالمين. After 70 days of the current crisis and bombardment and oppression on our brothers and sisters in Gaza and the West Bank, we hear the news of the martyrdom of almost 20,000, if not more, of our brothers and sisters, a third of whom are women and children. We ask that Allah Azza wa Jal relieve them from their suffering. May Allah Azza wa Jal reward them for their patience. May Allah Azza wa Jal remove from them the oppression. May Allah Azza wa Jal grant them victory and be peace. And may Allah Azza wa Jal grant them freedom. And you may have heard in the last few hours some of the famous journalists of Al Jazeera, Wael al-Dahduh, whose family was killed a few weeks ago. His wife, a couple of his children, his grandchildren. He was today injured, and his cameraman was surrounded by the IDF forces, not allowed to be taken by the ambulances, and over 5 hours he bled until he was martyred. We ask that Allah Azza wa Jal assist all of those who in Gaza on different fronts in combating this oppression, and that Allah Azza wa Jal reward their efforts and Allah Azza wa Jal accept their deeds and their martyrdom. To continue with where we left off last week, inshallah ta'ala, first of all we'll go through a quick summary as always of what we covered last week, just to jog our memories. So we covered the definition of a Nakba, the catastrophe of over 750,000 Palestinians being removed from their homes from all different parts of Palestine. So whether that be within the lines of the armistice of 1949, and within the West Bank, within Gaza. And as we saw the maps, Gaza is actually larger than what it is now, the Gaza Strip. And so the numbers of those who are displaced is over 200,000, if not more, from the surrounding areas of what is now known as the Gaza envelope to the small area which is Gaza now, and then to other countries surrounding, from Jordan, etc. We mentioned that over 500 villages were destroyed. We discussed the establishment of the United Nations Relief Agency specifically for Palestinian refugees, and what is known as the ongoing Nakba until today of Palestinians being driven out of their homes and new settlements coming in the place of Palestinian villages. Thereafter, we discussed the laws that were enacted in Israel. So, for example, we had the martial law, which was in effect from 1948 all the way to 1966, where the 150,000 or so Arabs who had remained within the newly created state of Israel had to get permits just to move from one village to another, or to leave their places where they were residing, etc. They were regarded as what was known as the fifth column of society. So you had the first column, who were the Jews, and thereafter you had second column, third column, and the Palestinians were regarded as the fifth column. And then we discussed absentee law, which was brought in with the effect that any Jew can take over any property within the state of Israel, and it is the onus on the Palestinian to prove that he wasn't there at that specific point in time. Thereafter, we had the law of return, which was brought in 1950, which gave every Jew on the surface of this earth the right to citizenship in Israel. And this then brought on mass immigration to this newly created state in hundreds of thousands, almost doubling their population within a short period of time. Thereafter, we had the armistice line of 1949. After the war came to an end, the Palestinians crossing the borders, some going for crops, some going for their families, visits, traveling, etc. And then we had a group that were known as the Fidayeen, or the freedom fighters. Sometimes they would come across and do attacks in a few places. But as we mentioned, the number of dead within a period of 3 years in Israel was 57, as compared to just in Jordan there were 629 between killed and injured within the same period of the retaliation attacks that were done by the Israeli army. Then we mentioned the Qibya massacre carried out by Ariel Sharon. 75 were killed, and we discussed the quotes and the denials and the statements that were made that it wasn't a IDF unit 101. In fact, it was just some settlers, and this then had a knock-on effect where over 1,000 of those Fidayeen or Palestinian freedom fighters were arrested in Jordan. We also mentioned that the Fidayeen were working towards a secular, democratic state of Palestine. Thereafter, we had the Levin affair, Operation Susanna, where Jamal Abdel Nasser, he took power in Egypt. He made an agreement with the British after some pressure, etc., due to the nationalist sentiments, that the British will stop patrolling the Suez Canal. Because remember, the largest military base outside of one's own country in the world was in Egypt at that time. Britain, after the World War II, had approximately 100,000 troops stationed in Egypt. There was no other country in the world that had that many foreign troops stationed. And they were directly involved in Jewish politics, in Egyptian politics, as we said. Previously they had surrounded the king's palace, etc. And then we discussed the Operation Susanna, which was the Zionist plot that Zionist Jews in Egypt will bomb the UK embassy, the US embassy, and places where Westerners visit, and then blame it on Islamists and Islamist groups who at that time in Egypt were the Muslim Brotherhood, and thereby gain international support for the removal of Jamal Abdel Nasser, because the Israeli government saw him as a threat. This didn't come to being because they were discovered, but again they denied, but then years later they then admitted to the plot. And in the end, after this plot was uncovered, we discussed Operation Black Arrow. And Operation Black Arrow was an operation or an attack carried out by the IDF, the Israeli forces and the Israeli army in Gaza in February 1955. And in this attack, up to 40 Egyptian soldiers were killed, as well as 30 Palestinians, and they blew up a railway station. So this was in summary of what we discussed last week. So obviously the tensions, as we can see, are rising between Egypt and Israel. The tensions are rising. And obviously, whilst the number of cross-border attacks by what were known as the Fidayeen, we discussed, had decreased on the side of Jordan after the massacre. However, from the Egyptian side, initially there had been, up to the February 1955, the number of attacks were very minimal. However, once the attack took place by Israel on Gaza in 1955, and Egyptian army, soldiers were killed, etc., then Egypt sort of turned a semi-blind eye to the number of attacks. So the number of attacks, or cross-border attacks from Egypt to the land of Israel, then increased. And this was part of what then led to this Suez Canal Crisis, which we will be discussing today, inshallah. So this was in 1956, so 1 year after the Operation Black Arrow. Now there's a background to this incident. We could just summarize the incident that Britain, France and Israel, they plotted together, they agreed in October that they will attack Egypt. They will take over the Sinai Desert and all the way until the Suez Canal and control the Suez Canal. And they attacked in October. In the end, thousands of Egyptians were killed, and militarily it was a victory for Israel and the British and the French. Israel took over basically the whole Sinai Desert, they took over the whole of Gaza, and they were not far from taking over the Suez Canal. Then through US pressure, etc., Britain and France withdrew, and a few months later Israel also withdrew, but it opened up the routes for Israel to take their shipping routes were opened, etc. Jamal Abdel Nasser stayed in place, and the situation of the Suez Canal basically stayed as it was. That's a summary, but there's an understanding of what exactly took place here. So at this point in time in history in the world, we have 4 different conflicts going on which are impacting Egypt and these countries. So we have, first of all, we have the Cold War. So the Cold War is between the Soviets, so USSR, and the USA and the Western Bloc. So that's one conflict that's going on. Then we have a second conflict. The second conflict is the Arab Cold War. So the Arab Cold War, so at that time there was a call for Pan-Arabism, what was known as Pan-Arabism, meaning that all of these Arab countries should join together, and they should be like the United States of America, they should be the United States of Arabia, or something to that effect. And they should all come under one leadership. So there might be different countries, but they should all be united under one leadership. There should be a central command for all of these countries. And however, there was a power struggle. There was a power struggle between the Hashemite kingdoms. So if you remember the King Hussein in Jordan, and so he's one Hashemite kingdom, and the other Hashemite kingdom was in Iraq at the time. So they were sort of close together. And then on the other hand, you had Egypt, who had closer ties with what was now the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and also Syria. And so there was a power struggle within these two blocks, that who should take the leadership of the Arab nations. So this was the Arab Cold War. And then at the same time we had Arab nationalism. So this is, and this we've mentioned in quite a few weeks, where the Arabs wanted, this seed had been sown for now almost a century, which initially brought them independence, or what they wanted was independence from the Ottoman rule and the Uthmani Khilafah. But then as a consequence, they then wanted independence also from the common masses, wanted independence from the colonial powers. So the colonial powers gave them the seed of nationalism so that they break away from the Ottoman Empire. But then they wanted to break away from the British colonialist impact as well, which was one of the reasons why Jamal Abdel Nasser came to power, which we mentioned last week. And then we had the obviously conflict between the newly created state of Israel and the Arabs in all the surrounding countries. So these are 4 different factors that were in play at the time of the canal, at the time of this crisis. So let's look at in brief the different all these different crises or situations that were in play. So first of all, we have Egypt, US, UK ties. So this ties in with the Cold War. So what we have is we have the United States. So they are at the forefront against USSR, against the Soviet Russia, and they see that Russia will be looking to have influence in the Middle East. So to curb the influence of Russia in the Middle East, what they set up is the MEDO, which is the Middle East Defense Organization. So their plan is that they want to set up an organization that will be allied with the US and Western interests, so a Middle East version of NATO, basically, that will defend Western interests within the Middle Eastern region. So in there you have visits from the US officials, etc., going to meet Jamal Abdel Nasser and other leaders in the region to try and tell them that the biggest threat to them is Russia. However, a lot of the reports that came out later on said that most of the Arab leaders, and specifically Jamal Abdel Nasser, who is a key figure in this crisis in Egypt, he saw the Israeli state as a greater threat than the USSR. And this was a common feature that they found amongst all the different Arab states. And so the US wanted Egyptian support as well as Arab support against USSR. And Egypt was seen sort of as a very powerful state at that time, or a state that plays a significant role. And at that time, the US was looking at the situation between Britain and Israel and Egypt. And they were sort of taking a neutral stance. So they weren't taking publicly sides. There was a spat between Egypt and Britain. And this was related to, obviously, the British forces in Egypt. So as we said, Jamal Abdel Nasser comes to power. There's a lot of disquiet in Egypt with regards to the British forces. And so Jamal Abdel Nasser is slowly trying to decrease British influence in the country. And this then leads on to the steps that he takes. And there's public spats all the way from 1956 all the way in 1955. In January 1956, people are the UK is discussing what are we going to do with Egypt. So throughout this whole war, US takes a neutral role between these countries, although it's supposed to be allied and it has a special relationship, as it's called, with UK. And so this is what's happening between the US and Egypt. At the same time, we have a relationship between France and Israel. So until this point, France didn't have that much of an input with regards to what's happening in Israel. We haven't discussed it much, except that all of the conferences, for some reason, always seem to be happening in France. The government doesn't seem to have much direct involvement. So at this point, what's happening in Algeria, so North Africa, is that there's a revolution and rebellion against French forces in Algeria. And the French forces are battling the local Algerians who want freedom from the French rule. And Jamal Abdel Nasser is directly helping the forces who are fighting against the French in Algeria. So the French are really annoyed with Jamal Abdel Nasser. They're really annoyed with Jamal Abdel Nasser. So what they do is, the French, they decide to ally with Israel as a counterbalance to Egypt. And then they start having these private meetings. They come to the UK, they talk to the British government, and we see the Prime Minister of France at that time. If you read the sources, he says, for example, he equates Jamal Abdel Nasser to Hitler, and he says that there's basically the Egyptian army is the Nazi threat to Israel and the Jews. There's a book written, The Theory of the Revolution, by Jamal Abdel Nasser, and he holds up a book of Mein Kampf, the book of Hitler, and the book of Jamal Abdel Nasser, and he says this is Jamal Abdel Nasser's Mein Kampf. So basically he said this is a new Hitler, this is the largest threat to world peace and to the Jews after their massacre and the Holocaust of World War II, and the threat is in the form of Egypt and Jamal Abdel Nasser. So Jamal Abdel Nasser is taken out to be is portrayed by France as this individual. So France is really strongly against Jamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt. And at the same time, there is what was known as a tri-party agreement. So there was an agreement by 3 parties. And this was between the US, the UK, and the other countries. That what they will do is, they will not arm the Arab countries or Israel any more than each other. So there were deals between the Arab countries and the West, and Israel and the West. And the agreement between them was that however much we arm Israel, the same amount of arms we'll give to the Arab countries. And whatever arms we give to the Arab countries, we'll give the same amount of arms to Israel. Because what they did not want was a replica of the arms race that's taking place between the US and the USSR. Obviously the USSR is building up weapons. The US is building up weapons, and that's when all the nuclear weapons, everything start coming in. So, and the increase of weapons on both sides. So they don't want the arms race to be taking place in the Middle East between Egypt and the Arab countries and Israel. What France does is, because of Egypt's support to the Algerian resistance, they then make a secret agreement with Israel, and they start funding Israel, and they start sending weapons, tanks, fighter jets, munitions, and start arming Israel with nothing in return. So they are arming Israel. Egypt, on the other hand, so if you remember, the US wanted Egypt to be on their side against the Soviets. Jamal Abdel Nasser, in fact, at one point they tried to bribe him with $3 million. So they told him, do not buy anything from Israel and buy the weapons from us. He took the $3 million, but he didn't stick to his word. And what he tried to do was, he tried to play these powers off each other so that he can increase his worth. So when the US offered him US arms, but they put in certain conditions, like for example, our forces will come, we will train your soldiers, we will remain on your soil, etc. He didn't accept that. Instead, what he did was, he went to a public conference with China, with the USSR, and he was the first from the Arab countries to recognize the People's Republic of China, and this caused an upset. And after that, he made an agreement with the Russians to bring in arms. So again, the agreement from the West was that they would supply equal arms. But now Israel is getting arms from France, and Egypt is getting arms from the USSR through Czechoslovakia. So they're shipping over from Czechoslovakia, flying them over to Egypt. So now Egypt has got up to a large number of weapons funded or supplied by the USSR through Czechoslovakia. So now there's an arms race, sort of like the main arms race between US and USSR, and there's a smaller arms race between Israel and Egypt. And Israel at this point sees or senses danger, that if Egypt is to get such a large amount of weapons from the USSR, then this is a danger to the existence of the Israeli state. So this threat is there. Then in July, 26th of July 1956, Jamal Abdel Nasser, he nationalizes the Suez Canal. So what happened was, initially the Suez Canal was built, it was a joint operation, French, British, and there were Egyptians involved as well. And then, if we remember, we discussed it in brief, where the British purchased part of it from the Egyptian government. So they had about a 44% stake inside the company. What Jamal Abdel Nasser did was that he announced the nationalization of this company in July 1956. What did that mean? That meant that this company will now be owned and all of its properties, everything will be owned by the Egyptian government. It will not be controlled by an independent company which was British, and which had a lot of British workers and also French workers. And the Suez Canal was at that point very important because it was waning in importance at that point. It wasn't as important as it has been previously, but it was very important because during the Second World War, majority of the oil used to pass through, especially the oil going to Western Europe and coming to Britain, was passing through the Suez Canal. And so at one point up to 90% of the oil would be coming through the Suez Canal. And so the Suez Canal would be very important. The British fears were that if, from amongst the fears, was that if the canal is nationalized and Egypt takes control of the canal, if they were to stop the oil, then our countries come to a standstill. And also we won't be gaining any profit from the Suez Canal. They saw it as their lifeline. And this was also reflected in the reaction of Australia and New Zealand. And so they all were on edge. Now what shall we do? Immediately after this, the British Prime Minister and the cabinet, so it was a conservative government at the time, they started talking about war. And there was huge public opinion in favor of war against Egypt. So this is happening in Britain after this nationalization. At the same time, Israel is getting worried because of the weapons and the attacks, the cross-border attacks. And France at the same time is annoyed with Egypt because of the support in Algeria. And so what happens is the French talk to the British, the French talk to the Israelis. So we have the Israeli Prime Minister, who's Ben-Gurion, David, who we've discussed already, the first Prime Minister of Israel. We have the French Prime Minister, Guy Mollet, and then we have the British Foreign Minister, who is Selwyn Lloyd. So they have a meeting. Obviously there's a series of meetings that take place from July, but they culminate in October. And what they do is they make a plan of how they're going to deal with Egypt in this situation, this scenario. But there's also as always, a separate agreement between France and Israel. France and Israel say, even if Britain doesn't agree, we will attack Egypt. Whether Britain says yes, whether Britain says no. But at the same time, they're having negotiations with Britain on how they should deal with Egypt. So remember, the same scenario is just going over itself. They have different agreements in different places. So they sit with Britain, they have a discussion. Eventually, Britain agrees. So in October, the British Foreign Minister and the Prime Ministers of both France and Israel, they agree that they are now going to attack Egypt. Now what's the plan? The plan is that Israel will attack, the Israeli army will attack Egypt. They'll come into Gaza, they'll come into the Sinai desert, and they'll attack Egypt. Britain and France will play the role of the police. So what they will say is, they will give an ultimatum. You have to stop fighting by this date. And if they don't stop fighting, then, and they won't, because obviously Israel's not going to stop, and the fighting is happening inside Egypt. And our Egyptian forces are not going to stop to defend their land. So Britain and France will enter into Egypt on the side of the Israelis, and but supposedly as the policing the war. And in that way, what they will do is they will take over the whole of the Sinai desert, all the way up to the south, and also take over the Suez Canal. Part of their plan is that is basically that they're going to take over the Suez Canal, stop Russian influence in Egypt, and remove Jamal Abdel Nasser from power. These are basically their goals and their aims. And so this plan is made in October between the British, the French, and the Israelis. So what happens is that Israel, on the 29th of October 1956, launches Operation Kadesh. So what they do is they get their troops, they come into Gaza, they come into Sinai. Paratroopers land in the Sinai desert, and very quickly they start pushing back the Egyptian army. Now Jamal Abdel Nasser, although he was a military man initially, but by now he was the leader of Egypt. And the man in charge of the military was more a political figure than a military figure. When the Israeli army enters into Sinai desert, he sees it as an incursion and not as an invasion and full-out war. So he doesn't really call an emergency, he just calls the troops who are there, just push them back. But by the time he calls an emergency, it's too late, they've come all the way far inside. Anyway, so on the 29th of October, Israeli forces at 3 p.m. in the afternoon, they invade both Gaza and the Sinai desert, and very quickly they push back. Their plan was that they're going to attack quick, fast and hard. That was their attack, and that's what they did. And they pushed back very quickly, the Egyptian forces were not ready. The next day, immediately, Britain and France give an ultimatum of 1 day, that the fighting must stop. Obviously nobody listened. So then, on the 31st, Britain and France start bombing Egypt. On the 31st, so within 2 days, Britain and France already entered the war and they start bombing Egypt. The Egyptian forces are stationed mainly in the Sinai desert, trying to stay the Israeli offensive on that side. And the British, for the past few months now, and the French, they have been building up their military presence in Cyprus and Malta. So it's not far from Egypt. And so then from there they start air raids, they start attacks in the sea from the British Navy and the French Navy, as well as the Israeli ships. So for example, you have an Egyptian ship that goes to attack the Israeli boats. Eventually the Egyptian ship is surrounded, it's taken by the Israelis after it's been damaged. Those on board, some of them are killed, some of them taken prisoner, and Israel repairs the ship and adds it to their fleet. At the same time, they were worried about an offensive from Jordan. So they put their forces on the side of the west, on the east of, so on the west bank, around the west bank, so on the east of, on the eastern border with Syria and Jordan. And while they are there, their forces, they carry out a massacre in Kafr Qasim, and they kill 45 innocent Palestinians in their homes. This is in the land which is Israel, so they're known as Israeli Arabs. So what happens is, in response to the bombing on the first day, Egypt sinks 40 ships that are inside the Suez Canal. They sink 40 ships. Now up to this point, until the bombing, until this invasion, the Suez Canal was still open. So by nationalizing, what the British and the French said was that the Suez Canal won't be able to operate properly. Now Jamal Abdel Nasser said that the British and the French employees can continue to stay employed as part of the business, but now it's owned by the Egyptian government. We will pay the salary rather than an independent company, private company. What British and French did was they withdrew all of their workers, with the intent that if they want to withdraw their workers, that means that the passage won't be smooth. The working of the company in the Suez Canal won't be smooth, and that will give them another reason to come back and take over the Suez Canal. Also what they did was they boosted and pumped up the number of ships and the traffic in the Suez Canal. But what happened was that Egypt replaced the British and French workers with Egyptian workers, and they continued to manage all the operations in the Suez Canal, even though the traffic was ramped up smoothly. So there were no negative impacts in terms of the shipping within and the movement of ships within the Suez Canal. So this did not give them any excuse in terms of the smooth movement of traffic to attack Egypt. So, but when they bombed, then Egypt sunk immediately 40 ships that were carrying, that were transporting in the Suez Canal. This then obviously blocked off traffic. Suez Canal is now closed to any traffic. And the British forces, they then land, and the French forces, they then land in Port Said. Now the Egyptian forces were not waiting for them in Port Said. As we said, there were many of them were in Alexandria and in the Sinai Desert. And so they come in, and the British forces start to advance at the same time. Now what we have is, we have the US. Now, as we said previously, the US said we're taking a neutral stance. So Eisenhower, who was the president of the US at the time, he had been in discussions with Egypt, he had been in discussions with Britain, with France, and he had strictly told the British that I will not support a war. And they had meetings before this took place, so 24 countries who all had stakes in Egypt, and these countries, etc., they all had stakes. They had a meeting that what should they do. The outcome of the meeting was that 18 of those states said that the control of the Suez Canal should be given to the British or to an international organization, and it should not remain within Egyptian control, because the Egyptians won't be able to control it. Egypt obviously refused. They said, no, we are capable of running the operations. Then there was a lot of negotiations that were going back and forth, where the US were involved, between Egypt and the US and the British, etc. And the US was now worried because of the Russian support for Egypt, and they did not want Russia to get involved directly in this war. The leader of Russia, once Britain and France invaded Egypt, he made a lot of public statements. So he threatened to enter the war. He threatened to obliterate Paris and London. He said, I have loads of nuclear warheads, and if Britain and France do not stop the attack on Egypt, I am ready for a nuclear war, and I will send these weapons, and I will send these missiles and attack London and Paris. And so now he makes these outrageous statements. Afterwards, the historians write that the leader of the USSR at the time was drunk half the time, and in reality he only had 5 missiles, not loads of stockpiles. But they didn't know that until many years later, once the US U-2 spy planes went over the whole of Russia and went from the east to the west and north to the south to work out how many missiles they actually had. But by then it was way too late. So they were scared that Russia, the USSR, and the Soviet Union would enter the war, and that would be very detrimental. They were also scared that the Arab states would then, that it would completely destroy the Middle East Defense Organization, which they had planned, because these states would then go and ally with USSR by default. So the US took a neutral stance. They told Egypt that they need to stop. They also told Israel that they need to stop. But because of what was happening, they took a more public stance in support of Egypt over their own allies of Britain, France, and Israel, because of the situation. To the extent that they were actually very harsh with Britain. And what they said, so obviously because of the Suez Canal now being closed and the war, etc., Britain had a huge deficit of about £45 million in its budget because of the oil deficiency. They attempted to, at the same time, Jordan blew up some of the pipelines of oil, and Britain tried to purchase oil from other European countries who refused. The US, they then applied for a loan from the IMF. So Britain, asking aid from the International Monetary Fund to assist them because of this financial deficit. The US vetoes the British request and says they are not allowed to take the money from the IMF. And then Eisenhower threatens the British, and he says he's going to start selling the sterling bonds that the US holds. And what that will mean is that basically the British economy will completely collapse, and the internal papers, which were released later on, show that the government was worried that we won't even be able to provide bread and water to our citizens. So, and over time, public pressure also changed, etc. But the key turning point, or the key reason which made Britain stop and halt its offensive, was US economical pressure on Britain. So US puts this pressure on the 7th of November, so it's not much, it's not a long time, but the UN, so initially they tried to bring a resolution in the UN Security Council. Now, as we know, who's in the UN Security Council? From the countries, you have Britain and France, right? So for the first time, and which was seen by some as a backstab by the US and USSR both vote together for a ceasefire, and is vetoed by France and Britain. And thereafter there's another resolution, which is a UN General Council resolution on the 7th of November, and obviously there's no veto power here, but Australia, New Zealand, Britain, France, Israel, they all vote against the ceasefire. The rest of the countries, including Russia and the US, vote for the ceasefire. Another reason was that at the same time while this was going on, the USSR had invaded Hungary, and they were fighting and taking over land in Hungary at the same time. And one of the problems was that if Britain and France can attack Egypt, then we can't say anything to the USSR for attacking Hungary. So this was another political reason where the US was supporting a ceasefire. Anyway, through this pressure, Britain unilaterally say, we're going to come back. So the Prime Minister Eden at the time, he orders the troops, the British troops, when they're in the middle of the battlefield and the battle's going on, stop. They send a message over. The British troops, they don't know what's happening. They stop. And then thereafter, after he told the British troops to stop, thereafter they informed the French and the Israelis. Anyway, the French and the Israelis also, the war stops. The French also withdraw, the British withdraw. The Israeli troops, however, they decline. They say, we're not going to withdraw from the Sinai Desert, we're not going to withdraw from Gaza, we're not going back because our security is at risk. The UN resolution also called for UN peacekeepers to be stationed, and the peacekeepers have to be neither from the USSR allied countries nor from the US and the NATO allied countries. They have to be neutral countries. So some random countries from Africa, etc. So these soldiers are supposed to be placed on the border of Israel and Egypt so as a peacekeeping force. Israel also refuses. They say, we will not have a single UN soldier on our soil. Eventually, they occupy all the way from the whole of the month of November, December, January, February, until March. So about 5 months, they occupy Gaza and the Sinai Desert, all the way until Sharm el-Sheikh. And eventually they come to an agreement in March 1957. Israel then withdraws from Sinai and the Gaza Strip. However, they have achieved a couple of goals. One is that the Suez Canal is now open for everyone, including Israeli ships, which at the time had been closed for specifically Israeli ships. At the same time, the Straits of Tehran are opened, which had been closed since 1950. So there's one seaport of the Israeli state which goes through the Red Sea, and this was closed at the time in 1950 by Jamal Abdel Nasser, and so that is then also opened, which hadn't been open for 6 years. So they are now able to get ships and shipments and trade from both sides. So this was in effect for Israel a victory in that sense. They didn't have any military losses, very minimal, and neither did they have any political losses, because they just stuck to their guns. They said, we don't care what the UN says, what the US says, what the British say, what the French say. We're going to stay here until you give us what we want. And later on, there are statements that were made by Eisenhower, who apologized to, for example, one of the main backers of the Republican Party in the US for not taking Israel's security into consideration, etc. In this scenario. But anyway, so this was a victory in that sense, for the state of Israel. Militarily, it was a defeat for Egypt. So if you look at the losses that were there, we have the joint losses of UK, France and Israel. There were only 200 soldiers killed. Only 200 were killed, and about 1,000 wounded. These are rounded figures. Majority of the injured, so around 170, 108 killed, 170, 180 are Israeli soldiers. The rest is a small number, 20 to 30 are French and British. On the Egyptian side, we have varying numbers. Some say 2,000, some say 3,000, some say up to 5,000 Egyptians were killed. From then, over 1,000 civilians, because Egypt was just being bombed in the main cities, in Cairo, airports, etc. At one point, when the war first started, French and British warplanes, they set off from Cyprus or Malta, and they were planning to bomb Cairo airport, but they called them back while the planes were still in air, because they realized that the US was evacuating its citizens from Cairo airport, and if they were to bomb Cairo airport, they would be killing US citizens, which would have been a massive problem. So the bombings were all over the place in Egypt at that time. So they had about 5,000 Egyptians wounded, and the numbers differ. Some say 5,000, some 10,000, some say up to 30,000 Egyptian soldiers were captured by and taken prisoner by the British, French, and mainly by the Israeli army. And while the Israeli army was in the Sinai desert and had taken over these areas all the way until March for 5 months, they destroyed all the infrastructure. So the telephone lines, the cables, electricity, railroads, they just destroyed all the infrastructure that there was in the Sinai desert. Some of the things which they found to be good, like some of the locomotives and trains, one of the 40-ton cranes, etc., that they thought were useful, they took them back to Israel for themselves to use. But everything else they destroyed. So when they withdrew from Sinai and Gaza in March, basically they left an absolute mess of the infrastructure, which all had to be built again. So if we just have a look at the map, it's not it may not be the clearest map, but this here is the Sinai desert. So to the left we have Egypt. We have in the middle of Egypt and the Sinai desert, we have what is called the Gulf of Suez. So this is the Suez Canal going through there, all the way to the Mediterranean Sea at the top. And we have on this side the port that Israel has right here. And this port going through the Straits of Tiran here, this is the port that was closed, that wasn't available for Israel to use from 1950 until this war. And as a conclusion of this war, in 1956, the Straits of Tiran were opened with the agreements that took place. This is also, for example, at the moment, the issue in the Gulf, in the same strait, where ships heading towards Israel are now being targeted and being stopped. They are heading towards this port here. That's where they are heading. So now this area here, which is right at the bottom of the Sinai desert, so right at the bottom point of the map, this is the famous place where everyone goes for holiday in Egypt, Sharm el-Sheikh. So the Israeli forces had taken over Sharm el-Sheikh. They had gone and entered, and they had entered Sharm el-Sheikh within a few days. Their forces, if you look at the blue arrows, this is how they entered. They attacked Gaza from there, and the main, so they went to north, the city of Gaza, and at the same time they attacked Rafah. So Rafah is the border crossing between Egypt and Gaza, which obviously is in the news on a daily basis today as well, and they have also started attacking there now. So Rafah was a very important crossing for them. What they did was they would invade Rafah, border town between Egypt and Gaza, and thereby encircling all the troops that are inside Gaza, not allowing any backup, etc. to come at that time. And at the same time, paratroopers would land in all the main cities in Egypt, in the Sinai Desert, and head towards the Suez Canal. The British and French forces, if you look at the top on the left hand side, there are two red circles, and this is where the British forces were heading towards, and right at the top is Port Said, and this is where the British and the French forces landed to combat the Egyptian forces. And this is where which basically the Suez Canal makes it easy for ships to travel from the east and Asia through to Europe by not having to go around the whole of Africa. Otherwise, they'd have to travel all the way down South Africa, go all the way around to come back into the Mediterranean. So this basically cuts short their path. And we had a crisis approximately a year ago where one ship got stuck for a few days in the Suez Canal, which had a massive impact on international shipping. So it's a very key route. However, there was something which was not realized by the British at the time. They thought that the Suez Canal was of much more importance than it actually was for them at that point in time, mainly because of oil, because what they thought, as was during the Second World War, which is why they had 100,000 troops stationed there to keep the Suez Canal open, that all the oil was coming through the Suez Canal. But by this point, there were massive oil tankers, ships, which were way too big to even fit through the Suez Canal. And so most of the ships had started taking the longer route because they were much more larger, and eventually, in terms of oil, this took on from this point on, it wasn't a major hindrance in terms of the passage of oil in the following years. But anyway, eventually it returns back to Egyptian control. Egypt continues to manage the Suez Canal. It stays as a nationalized company, and Jamal Abdel Nasser stays in power. And in terms of military loss, it was a loss for the Egyptian army, as we saw. But politically, it strengthened Jamal Abdel Nasser and his status in the Arab world. And so he was seen as a savior of the Arabs, the first to stand up to the colonialist powers and fight against them. Stories are written in Egyptian literature with regards to the stand of the Egyptian army in Port Said against Britain and British and French troops, etc. And he almost became like a legend for his stance. In terms of Britain, it was they didn't really gain much, and it was politically a disaster. The Prime Minister had to resign, and there was a huge investigation which took place of why did Britain actually go forward and take these steps, especially since they waited so long. It was nationalized in July, and they didn't attack all the way until October, the end of October. So why did they wait this long? By that time, the support of the different groups, etc., the opposition parties and the public had sort of waned off, as well as the army. Some of the officers of the army of the time say that while the reservists had been called up months ago, they basically thought that it's not going to happen because it's not important anymore. But when they were given the instruction for war, one of the officers, for example, he says that I had to rally the troops and rally them up for war and tell them to fight when I really did not know what I was fighting for, let alone the troops. But he said, despite that, only one British soldier refused to fight, even though none of them knew what they were fighting for. Anyway, that tells you something else. But there was a huge political issue for Britain, and this basically saw the decline of the British Empire and British colonialism. The Prime Minister who succeeded Eden, the process of decolonization of all of the countries that Britain had been in basically sped up. And if you look at the history of all of these countries gaining independence from British direct rule or influence, they happened very soon after this incident. Many of the countries, one by one, they start gaining independence from British influence. So in terms of political impact, it was positive for Egypt, it was negative for Britain and France, and for Israel, basically they didn't have a negative impact, they had a positive impact in that their sea routes were opened. Inshallah, we'll stop here today, and in next week's session, Bismillah, we'll discuss the war that took place in 1967, the 6-day war, in detail, inshallah ta'ala. If there are any questions before we finish today? No?
Territorially, was it after the war, was it pretty much the same as it was before? So did Israel withdraw from the areas that they had?
Yeah, so territorially, although during the war they quickly took over the whole of basically the Sinai Desert and Gaza, after occupying, staying there for 5 months, once they withdrew, yes, they withdrew back to the areas, the lines that were there before. Sorry, one point, Jazakallah for the question, is that if you remember Israel, they refused to have any UN peacekeepers on their land. So once it was actually implemented, the UN peacekeepers were inside Egypt, not in Israel, and that stopped any attacks from taking place against Israel from the Palestinian forces and resistance, etc., that were inside Egypt. So the border for Egypt basically became, for Israel, with Egypt also became basically secure, and no more cross-border attacks were taking place. Because until that point, Egypt was seen to be a supporter of these attacks, not only from there but also from Jordan. So they had sent, according to the, well, there's conflicting reports, but according to the reports at that time, Egypt was supporting the attacks of the Fidayeen from Jordan, not only from Egypt, so that the fingers won't always be pointed at Egypt. So yeah, the UN peacekeepers were on Egyptian land inside the Sinai Desert rather than the Israeli side. Any other questions?
So that this area included Gaza at the time, so the Sinai Desert, is that correct?
So the Sinai Desert didn't include Gaza. Gaza is inside what is Palestine. It's not Egyptian territory. But after 1948, basically the rule of Gaza came under Egypt. So Gaza was ruled by, we had a small kingdom which we mentioned initially, the Mufti Amin al-Husseini, who was in charge of Gaza after the war, but then his government collapsed very quickly, and Gaza was basically ruled by, you could say, to use the modern political or geopolitical terms, like a satellite state of Israel, or satellite province of Israel. Sorry, not Israel, Egypt. So Egypt had sent somebody to be in charge of Gaza. So they'd have a minister, Egyptian minister, who's in charge of ruling Gaza. So the minister of Egypt was ruling Gaza. He had obviously withdrawn at this point, and then after 5 months he was reinstated again once Israel withdrew.
But Palestinians were living there.
Yeah, Palestinians. So like today, basically, it's the same area that is Gaza today, the exact same length. So it's a very small strip. Probably the maximum point is about 15 kilometers in width. Between 6 to 10 kilometers most of the part, the length about 41 kilometers. That's it. And this is Gaza. Now this isn't the original Gaza. The original Gaza was much larger than what it is now. But what it is now, this is the strip that was there this time as well. The exact same piece of land. Palestinians were living there, displaced. So when we talk about the refugee camps in Gaza now, these are the refugees from 1948. And a refugee camp doesn't necessarily mean tents, because there's hundreds of thousands. They've been living there for 75 years. They've built homes. They buy and sell their homes and their apartments inside those camps. But these people are not from that area itself. They're refugees who have come from all of these surrounding areas of the Gaza envelope, which went all the way up to the city of Asqalan. So from the city of Asqalan, in fact, Gaza, the province of Gaza, was joint with the West Bank. The province of Gaza was joint with the West Bank originally. So if you look at what is now known as the Gaza envelope, that goes all the way up to the West Bank. So this is the original Gaza. But in the war in 1948, they pushed everyone back into this small strip, and in this small strip was called Gaza, and then the rest of it was called the Gaza envelope. So that's the in terms of the geographical details. So it goes back to Egyptian control basically. Gaza is under Egyptian control. The Egyptian minister is administrating Gaza. So that's why when you hear the reports that Palestine was never ruled by Palestinians, or there never existed a Palestinian state, and it was ruled by Egypt, or it was ruled by Jordan, etc. This is one of the reasons that is given.
I was about to ask that question. So was Palestine there at all? Is it Egypt ruling Gaza and Israel is on West Bank? Was Palestine there at all?
No, so Israel is not in the West Bank. West Bank is being run by Jordan. Yeah. So sorry.
King Abdullah.
King Hussein. Yeah, King Hussein. Abdullah was his father. So sorry, right. King Hussein is the father, Abdullah is the son. So King Abdullah was in Jordan, and this is where they had the Arab Cold War, influence. Jordan and Egypt were on opposite sides. Before the Suez Canal Crisis, they had something called the Baghdad Pact, and in the Baghdad Pact there was an agreement between the US, Iraq, Iran, Turkey, and Britain. So initially it was supposed to be the US, Iraq, Iran and Turkey against the Soviet interests. But Britain said, no, Iraq is our ally. We got total influence over Iraq, so we're going to be part of this agreement. So these countries, they had an agreement. It was called the Baghdad Pact. It happened just before this crisis. And it was one of the reasons why Egypt did whatever they did, because they saw the Baghdad Pact as a threat to Jamal Abdel Nasser becoming the leader of the Arab world, because they saw that now these states are now supporting the Hashemite kingdoms of Iraq and Jordan. So Jordan were basically ruling West Bank, and Egypt was ruling the Gaza Strip. So I mean, the whole issue of whether it's a state of Palestine or not a state of Palestine, you can discuss it in different ways, as I said before. The reality is, whatever you name it, whatever you describe, this land belongs to the local indigenous people. It doesn't belong to somebody who came from outside and took it and said, now it belongs to me. If that's the understanding. And with regards to the area which was known as Palestine, this was known as Palestine before 1948. If you look in the writings of the letters of Hitler, for example, in late 1930s, he calls this area Palestine. The British mandate of Palestine, it designates this land as Palestine. Whether they gave them their own autonomous rule or not, that's a separate issue. But just because a country comes in and starts managing a certain area, that does not mean that that land has stopped being whatever it is. Otherwise, you can say that, for example, now Crimea is part of Russia. It's not Ukraine. Or the areas where Russia has come into all of these different countries in Ukraine, it's not Ukraine anymore, it's Russia. But they will say no, these are the borders of Ukraine. So in the same way, whether there's Egyptian administration due to whatever reasons, Jordan administration in the West Bank due to whatever reasons, that doesn't make those areas Jordan or Egypt. But again, that comes back to nationalism and other problematic issues for us as Muslims. Nationalism has created boundaries where there shouldn't be boundaries, has created issues and conflicts where there shouldn't be issues and conflicts. We don't conform to these boundaries based on race and nationalities. Allah Azza wa Jal says in the Quran that Allah Azza wa Jal created mankind from one mother, one father, made them different colors, different nationalities, all of these different places. Why? Just so that they recognize one another, not for the sake of allegiance. Our allegiance is to Allah and His Messenger and to Islam. So these states where the seed of nationalism was sown in Egypt and Jordan and Palestine and Arabia and all of these different places, this split up the Muslim world rather than them being united and joined before. And this continues until today, where you have all of these states competing with one another rather than all of them working together as states of Muslims. But that's a long different issue for our discussion. But these all have an impact on obviously what happens since then until today. When people say, why don't these people get involved, or why doesn't this state get involved, etc. Why are all of these states surrounding just watching what's taking place and not doing anything? It all comes back to the seeds of nationalism that was sown at that point in time and continue to be part of the reality of the situation, including within Palestine itself. As we said, the elites of the time, they had nationalist views, like for example at the time of the war which we will discuss in the 6-day war in Egypt, this war that took place, even though it was very short, the previous war that took place in 1948, these wars were not, the slogans in these wars were not that the respect is for Allah, al-izzatu lillah, or for the sake of Islam. No. This was al-izzatu lil-Arab, that respect and honor is for the Arabs. It was the war was for Arabism. It wasn't for Islam. Yeah, that we are Arabs and this is an Arab state, and it belongs to Arabs. It doesn't belong to anyone other than Arabs. So it's a nationalistic war. These wars that were taking place, even though they were against Israel, but they were on the basis of we are Arabs, not that this is a Muslim or land belonging to Islam, and that we are Muslims. So they had differences, as we mentioned, 1948 war, they had differences in part of the Suez Canal was a massive problem. Suez Canal is taking place. Egypt has been invaded. Jordan doesn't get involved, Syria doesn't get involved, Lebanon doesn't get involved. They got absolutely nothing to do with it. In fact, they are happy because they want Jamal Abdel Nasser to be defeated, Jordan and Iraq, because they are looking for leadership of the Arab world. So they have their own nationalistic goals in mind. It's not on the basis of Islam.
Even that is there today.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. That continued from then until today. Any other questions?
So there was no move on the part of Egypt and Jordan at the time to give Palestinians independence in effect within Gaza and West Bank as it stood.
So at that point, no. So Jordan had control over the West Bank, and there was conflict between Jordan and the Palestinian freedom fighters or people calling for freedom in Palestine. Egypt, they had control over Gaza, and they had set up initially the Gaza government, which they had called the the government of Palestine, but eventually that was dissolved. It didn't really come to being, and it was basically just run under Egyptian rule. It was never one government for the West Bank and Gaza, united in a central location. And at that point, although they had set up the initial government that was supposed to cover both areas, but it was not possible because Egypt is controlling here, Jordan's controlling there, and they're not on the same page. They're competing powers. So no, there wasn't a central government that covered both the West Bank and Gaza. No. There were talks of Jordan, for example, annexing the West Bank, making it part of Jordan, due to underhand agreements with Israel, for example, which we discussed previously already with regards to the borders, when Israel didn't even enter the West Bank, if you remember. So yeah, there was no central government at that time. We're going to go into the details of, just in brief, of who's ruling which area or when. Inshallah, we'll cover that as a timeline, inshallah. Anything else? Okay, inshallah, we'll stop here, inshallah. We ask that Allah Azza wa Jal grants us the true understanding of what took place, what is taking place, and Allah Azza wa Jal enable us to work with all that we have been given by Allah Azza wa Jal for the freedom of our brothers and sisters, and for the freedom of the Ummah in the blessed lands, in Al-Quds, around Al-Quds and Bayt al-Maqdis, in Gaza, in the West Bank, in all of the occupied areas. We ask that Allah Azza wa Jal grants freedom to our brothers and sisters and victory, and relieves them from their oppression, and grants them peace and tranquility and blessings. وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين.